The train pulled into Cell Station in the autumn of 1978. Thomas Fairfield stepped onto the platform with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a memory that had haunted him for 33 years. He was 61 now, his hair gone silver, his hands marked by decades of work in a Manchester textile mill. The other passengers hurried past him, businessmen, students, families. None of them aware that the old Englishman standing motionless on the platform had once arrived in this region as part of an occupying army. Celle hadn't changed as much as he'd feared. The half-timbered houses still lined the streets, their painted facades bright against the October sky, but the rubble was gone. The hollow-eyed children, he remembered, thin as shadows, watching British trucks roll through with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. They'd grown into adults now, or they died. He didn't know which possibility troubled him more. He asked for directions in his rusty German, surprised when the words came back to him. The young woman at the station smiled, patient with his accent. 20 minutes north by local bus, she told him. The village of Vita. Did he have family there? Something like that, Thomas said. The bus ride took him through countryside that looked peaceful, almost sleepy. Fields of harvested grains stretched toward pine forests. Pharmacies sat secure behind neat fences. It was impossible to imagine what this land had looked like in May of 1945. The smoke, the displaced persons wandering the roads, the German soldiers in their field grey uniforms, defeated but still armed, watching the British convoys with sullen, unreadable faces. Thomas had been 28 then, a sergeant in the Durham Light Infantry, part of Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group. They'd crossed the Rhine in March, fought their way into the heart of Germany, and by the time Hitler put a bullet in his head, Thomas and his battalion were billeted in a cluster of villages north of Celle. The war in Europe was over, but the peace, if you could call it that, had only just begun. Vita appeared through the bus window like something from a forgotten dream. The church spire first, then the cluster of buildings around a small square. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He'd thought about this moment for years, rehearsed what he might say. But now that he was here, the words scattered like leaves. He got off at the square and stood there, aware of eyes watching him from windows. An old man feeding chickens in a yard stopped and stared. A woman hanging laundry paused, her hands still gripping a wet sheet. Thomas realized he must look strange to them. This elderly Englishman in a worn coat standing in their village square with no car, no companion, just standing there as if he'd lost something and couldn't quite remember what. The house was easy to find. He'd written to the Burgermeister 3 months ago, asking if the RTA family still lived in the village. The mayor's reply had been brief but kind. Yes, they were still there. The same house. Efrae was 82 now. Her daughter, Greta, who'd been 13 in 1945, was married with children of her own. Thomas walked slowly down the narrow street, his heart hammered against his ribs. The house looked smaller than he remembered, its stone walls weathered but solid. The garden, which had been trampled and bare in 1945, now bloomed with late roses and chrysanthemums. Someone had painted the shutters a cheerful blue. He stood at the gate for a long time before he found the courage to knock. The door opened. A woman in her mid-40s stood there, her dark hair streaked with grey, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of a stranger. "Greta," Thomas said. She stared at him. For a moment he thought she didn't recognize him. Why would she? He'd been a young soldier then, and she'd been a child. But then her hand went to her mouth, and he saw the recognition flood her face. "My God," she whispered, the English sergeant. Before he could respond, she turned and called into the house, "Mutti, Mutti, schnell." An elderly woman appeared behind Greta, moving slowly with the help of a cane, Frey. Her face was deeply lined now, her frame bent, but her eyes, those sharp, tired eyes Thomas remembered, were the same. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said in careful English, "You came. I came alone." Greta's voice carried a note of disbelief. "You came alone," Thomas nodded. He understood what she was really asking. No soldiers, no investigation team, no official business, just him, an old man keeping a promise he'd made to himself 33 years ago. Greta's voice broke. "Mutti," He came alone. Frau Richter leaned heavily on her cane, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment no one spoke. Then she stepped forward and with trembling hands reached out to touch Thomas's face. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you for coming back." The story of why he'd come, why he traveled 1,000 miles to stand at this door, began in the chaos of May 1945, when his battalion was assigned to occupy the villages around Chell and establish order in a defeated nation. The orders from command were clear: non-fraternization. British soldiers were not to socialize with German civilians, not to share food, not to show sympathy. The Germans had started the war, caused untold suffering, and now they would face the consequences. Thomas and his men were billeted in houses throughout Vita, requisitioned by order of the military government. The German families who lived there had no choice but to comply. Thomas' unit took over the Richter house. It was one of the better ones in the village, with 4 rooms and a small barn. Frau Richter was a widow. Her husband had been killed in Russia in 1943. She lived there with her daughter Greta and her elderly mother, who was bedridden and dying. When Thomas and 3 other soldiers arrived to requisition the house, Frau Richter stood in the doorway and asked in halting English if they would please allow her mother to remain in the upstairs room. "She is very sick," Frau Richter said quietly. "She will not live long. Please, I beg you. Let her die in her own bed." Thomas looked at the woman. She held herself with dignity despite her fear, despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Behind her, the girl, Greta, watched with enormous dark eyes. "She can stay," Thomas said. His men looked at him, surprised, but they didn't argue. They'd all seen enough death. What harm could one dying old woman do? In the weeks that followed, an uneasy coexistence developed. Thomas and his men slept in the downstairs rooms. Frau Richter and Greta stayed upstairs caring for the grandmother. They shared the kitchen, taking turns cooking their meager rations. The rules said no fraternization, but in the close quarters of that house, complete separation was impossible. Thomas began to notice things. The way Greta flinched at sudden noises, the way Frau's hands shook when she tried to light the stove, the small portions they took for themselves, always less than what they gave the dying grandmother upstairs. One evening in June, Thomas came back to the house after a long day of guard duty. He found Greta sitting on the back step, crying silently into her hands. She looked up when she heard him, wiped her eyes quickly and started to stand. "It's all right," Thomas said. "You can stay." She sat back down, her thin shoulders shaking. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting on the step below her. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then in broken English she said, "Omar died today in the afternoon." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. "I'm sorry." "We have nothing," Greta said softly. "No money for the burial. No wood for a coffin. Muti is asking the carpenter, but he says he has no wood and we cannot pay." She looked at him with those enormous eyes. "We will have to wrap in a sheet and bury her like a beggar." That night, Thomas and 2 of his men went into the woods beyond the village. They cut down a small pine tree, carried it back, and spent the next day building a coffin. It wasn't beautiful. None of them were carpenters, but it was solid. They even found some white paint in the barn and gave it a coat. When Frau Richter saw it, she wept. Not the quiet tears Thomas had seen her shed before, but great racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Greta held her mother while Thomas and his men stood awkwardly by, unsure what to do. "Thank you," Frau Richter finally managed. "You did not have to do this." "I know," Thomas said. The grandmother was buried in the village cemetery. Thomas and his men carried the coffin. The villagers watched in silence, German civilians seeing British soldiers perform this small act of decency, this acknowledgement that their grief was real. After that, something shifted. Frau Richter began teaching Thomas German in the evenings, patiently correcting his pronunciation. Greta showed him how to make potato soup stretch further. When Thomas's commanding officer came through the village on inspection, Thomas lied in his report, saying the requisitioned house was satisfactory and the occupants were compliant. He didn't mention the coffin. He didn't mention that he'd started sharing his cigarette rations with Frau Richter so she could trade them for extra food. But what haunted him most happened in late July, when word came through that he and his unit would be moving to a new posting. Their time in Vita was ending. The night before they left, Frau Richter made a special dinner from supplies Thomas had quietly provided. Potatoes, a bit of meat from the army kitchen, even some real coffee. They sat together at the kitchen table, all the rules about non-fraternization forgotten. Greta had practiced a little speech in English to thank them. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We know you did not have to be kind," she said. "Many soldiers were not kind. You could have been cruel. You had reason to be cruel, but you were not. You helped us. You helped Omar die with dignity. We will remember this always." Thomas looked at this girl, this enemy child who'd lost her father, her grandmother, nearly everything, and felt ashamed. Ashamed of every slur he'd heard British soldiers use about Germans. Ashamed of his own hatred, which had seemed so righteous when he was fighting through France and Belgium, but which now felt hollow and small. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for what you've been through." Frau Richter reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "The world is broken," she said quietly. "But maybe we can be a little less broken to each other." The next morning, as Thomas and his men loaded their kit onto the truck, Frau Richter and Greta stood in the doorway. Thomas hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden carving he'd been working on in his spare time. It was rough, clearly made by an amateur, but recognizable, a bird in flight. He handed it to Greta. "For you," he said, "so you remember that better things can fly away from darkness." She took it with trembling hands, her eyes full of tears. "I will come back," Thomas found himself saying. "When things are better, I will come back and visit you properly as a friend." "You cannot promise such things," Frau Richter said gently. "I can, I will." But of course life had other plans. Thomas was demobilized in 1946, returned to Manchester, found work in the mills. He married a kind woman named Margaret, had 3 children, watched them grow, and have children of their own. The years passed like water, each one carrying him further from that house in Vita. He thought about them, though, Frau and Greta. He wondered if they'd survived the hard years after the war, if they'd found some measure of peace. He almost wrote several times, but never sent the letters. What would he say? How could he explain that a few weeks in a requisitioned house had changed something fundamental inside him, had made him question everything he thought he knew about enemies and victims and the clean lines between right and wrong? It was Margaret's death in 1977 that finally pushed him to act. Years old, cancer. The grief hollowed him out, left him staring at his life and wondering what any of it meant. One night, sitting alone in their house, he found himself thinking about that morning in 1945, standing in the doorway of the Richter house, promising to return. He'd never kept that promise. 2 months after Margaret's funeral, he wrote to the Burgermeister of Vita. Now, in October of 1978, he stood at the gate of that house again. Greta insisted he come inside. Frau Richter moved slowly to her chair by the window, settling with a small grunt of effort. A young woman appeared, Greta's daughter, who looked startlingly like Greta had at 13, carrying a tray with coffee and cake. "This is Ela," Greta said, "my oldest. She was born in 1960. Thomas shook the girl's hand. She smiled at him with curious politeness, clearly wondering who this English stranger was. They sat in the same room where Thomas had slept 33 years ago. The furniture was different now, more comfortable. Pictures lined the walls. Children, grandchildren, a man Thomas assumed was Greta's husband. A life lived, a family rebuilt from ruins. "Tell me," Thomas said, "tell me what happened after we left." Frau Richter and Greta took turns speaking their voices, soft, recounting the hard years. The hunger in the winter of 1946 to 47, when people starved despite the Allied occupation. Greta's struggle to continue her education, eventually becoming a teacher. Frau Richter's work cleaning houses for British officers in Chell to earn money. The slow, painful process of rebuilding Germany, of living with the shame of what their nation had done while trying to survive each day. It was difficult, Frau said simply. But we lived, we are here. And you? Greta asked. You had a good life. Thomas told them about Margaret, about his children, about the millwork that had broken his back but kept food on the table, about losing Margaret and realizing he had loose ends that needed tying. I made you a promise, he said to Frau. I said I would come back. The old woman's eyes glistened. 33 years is a long time to remember a promise. Some promises shouldn't be broken. Greta stood abruptly, leaving the room. She returned a moment later, holding something small in her hands. She opened her palm to show him the wooden bird he'd carved, its surface worn smooth from decades of handling. I kept it, she said. I kept it all these years. When I was frightened, when things were very bad, I would hold it and remember that an enemy soldier had been kind to us, that people could choose to be human to each other, even in the worst times. Thomas felt his throat close. He reached out and gently closed Greta's fingers around the carving. Keep it, he said hoarsely. It belongs with you. That evening, word spread through the village that the English sergeant from 1945 had returned alone. Several elderly villagers came by, some of them remembering Thomas, others simply curious. There was Hans Müller, who'd been a teenage boy working in the fields in his father's old Wehrmacht uniform. Frau Weber, whose husband had died in the war and who'd struggled to feed 4 children. Old Herr Schmidt, who'd been suspicious of the British soldiers at first, but who now gripped Thomas's hand and thanked him for treating them with dignity. We expected vengeance, Hesmit said quietly. We deserved vengeance. Some of the soldiers gave us that, but some, like you, showed us mercy instead. That meant everything. They invited Thomas to stay with them. Greta's husband, Klaus, was a quiet man who spoke little, but whose handshake was firm and warm. Their children, Ella, and her 2 younger siblings listened with wide eyes as their mother and grandmother told stories about the English soldiers who'd helped them during the darkest time. Over the next 3 days, Thomas walked through Vita. He visited the cemetery where the grandmother was buried, now surrounded by other graves from those years. He saw the church, which had been damaged but was now restored. He met with the current Burgermeister, who told him how rare it was for veterans to return, how most Germans and former Allied soldiers preferred to leave the past buried. But you came back, the mayor said. Why? Thomas thought about that question, about Margaret's death, stripping away all his excuses, about getting old and realizing that the things that haunt you don't fade with time. They just wait, because I needed them to know, he finally said, that they weren't just names in a report or faces in a conquered village, that they mattered, that even in occupation, in the middle of all that hatred and trauma, human connection was possible. I needed them to know I remembered. On his last evening in Vita, the Artors held a small dinner. Kloos grilled sausages in the garden while Greta and her mother prepared salads. The children played in the yard, their laughter bright in the autumn air. Neighbors stopped by with bottles of wine and homemade cake. It felt less like a farewell and more like a celebration of something that shouldn't have been possible. Enemies becoming friends, hatred transforming into understanding across 3 decades. As darkness fell and candles were lit on the table, Frau raised her glass. To Thomas, she said, her voice steady despite her age, who came back alone as a friend, who showed us that even in war there is room for mercy, who proved that the human heart can hold both memory and forgiveness. Everyone raised their glasses. Thomas felt tears on his cheeks but didn't try to hide them. Later, as he prepared to leave for the train station the next morning, Greta pulled him aside. What you did, she said quietly, building that coffin for Omar, treating us like people instead of defeated enemies. You cannot know what that meant. In those days, we felt like nothing, like we deserved nothing. To have someone see us as human, worthy of basic decency, it changed something in me. It made me believe we could survive, that we deserved to survive. You did more than survive, Thomas said. Look at your family. Look at what you've built. Yes, Greta smiled through her tears. But it started with kindness. With you seeing us when you didn't have to. With you remembering us when it would have been easier to forget. The train back to Shell was nearly empty. Thomas sat by the window watching the German countryside roll past. He thought about Frau's words. The world is broken, but maybe we can be a little less broken to each other. He'd spent 33 years carrying the weight of that summer in 1945, carrying the memory of a widow and her daughter, of a coffin built in secret, of promises made in the doorway of a requisitioned house. He'd wondered if keeping that promise mattered, if one old man's return could mean anything at all. But he'd seen Greta's face when she showed him the carved bird. He'd heard the tremor in Frau Richter's voice when she said, "You came." He'd watched the children play in a garden that had once been trampled by occupation boots. Their laughter proved that life could heal, that nations could rebuild, that former enemies could sit together at a table and share bread. One man returning alone to a German village wouldn't change history. It wouldn't undo the war or heal all the wounds. But for one family in one small village, it meant that someone remembered, someone cared enough to come back. Someone believed that the connections forged in the ruins mattered more than the hatred that created those ruins. The train pulled into Shell station as evening fell. Thomas gathered his leather satchel and stepped onto the platform, the same platform where he'd arrived 3 days ago. But he felt lighter now, as if he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Somewhere in Vita, Frau Richter sat in her chair by the window, a carved wooden bird on the table beside her. Greta tucked her children into bed, telling them stories about when the world was broken. And a British soldier chose kindness over cruelty. And in that choice, in that small act of humanity, something survived that was stronger than any army, more enduring than any empire. The world remembers the grand gestures of war, the invasions, the victories, the treaties signed at conference tables. But healing happens in quieter moments, in a coffin built for an old woman, in a wooden bird carved by rough hands, in an elderly veteran standing at a door 33 years later, alone, fulfilling a promise that nobody would have blamed him for forgetting. "You came alone," Greta had said, her voice filled with wonder. Yes, Thomas thought as he boarded his train back to Hamburg, back to England, back to the life he'd built from the same ruins that had shaped them all. "I came alone because some promises shouldn't wait for armies. Some acts of remembrance are meant to be personal, quiet, and real." The engine rumbled to life beneath him. Through the window, he caught one last glimpse of the lights of Shell glowing in the darkness. And somewhere beyond them, in a small village he would never forget, a family went to sleep knowing that they had been seen, remembered, and valued, not as enemies, but as people. That, Thomas realized, was what he traveled 1,000 miles to say. That in the end, the war hadn't been between armies, but between versions of ourselves. The version that sees only enemies, and the version that, even in hatred's midst, can recognize shared humanity. He'd fought for his country, done his duty, played his part in defeating evil. But what he was most proud of, what he wanted to be remembered for, was those few weeks in a requisitioned house when he'd chosen to build a coffin for an old woman and carved a bird for a grieving child. In the mathematics of war, these were negligible acts. In the arithmetic of healing, they were everything.